Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Nick Pohl. I'm with the Mission and Action Committee here at the church, and along with Martha Floyd. Thank you all for being here. This is a very important issue, and I believe it impacts everybody in one way or another. So I do think it's an important community conversation. We on Mission and Action have been looking at this issue for a while. We did a survey of the congregation to find out what areas of focus we want to look at for this year, and overwhelmingly housing was an area of focus in this congregation. And historically we've supported affordable housing basically financially. And though we continue to commit to do that, we are looking at different ways that we can contribute to this important issue in our area. And one of those ways that I think we can play a particular role at is being an asset around being a point of conversation, of bringing people together to keep this conversation happening. And I really appreciated what Carolyn was speaking to today. So much of this issue is hidden, and I appreciated so much of her personal vignettes and stories. You know, as somebody, myself who lives in, insecure housing, it is a real issue, and it's an issue that if you don't know, it's easy to lose that perspective. So part of this is just to keep the conversation alive in our congregation and in our greater community. I do want to give a few housekeeping items as we get into this. We'll go about an hour and 15 minutes or so. Martha, who you see standing over there, is holding some cards and pencils. So as our panelists introduce themselves and speak to the issue, Martha will just be handing out cards to people. And if you have a question, we just ask you to write it on the card, and you can raise your hand, and I'll come around and pick that card up from you. So after each of our panelists speak, we'll spend time doing Q&A, and then panelists will be around afterwards. So if you have questions or want further information or further conversation, panelists will be here. We'll fully convene about 1 o'clock or so. Mark Mills introduced himself to me. I didn't know him before a few minutes ago, and a part of keeping this conversation alive is sharing resources. And Mark is, are you with the town of Stockbridge?
I'm on the Affordable Housing Trust Committee.
Okay.
We have a committee of 7 members, including Patrick White as the selectman's representative to the board. And we are trying to wrestle this along with some of the other people in town. And so I gave you a note, just a note that we're having an event which we set up before I knew about this one. This Thursday, the 29th, at the Stockbridge Library, from 6:30 to 7:30 in Carolyn Valley. And Randy Warner is the chair of the Stockbridge Affordable Housing Trust. So we have not competing events, we're all pulling in the same direction.
Complimentary events.
Why don't you do that?
We also we're working with a consultant working on the housing production plan, and there's a wonderful movie appearance on our work, and we're doing the second half of kind of a discussion of the issues are tomorrow at 4 o'clock.
Great.
It's also streaming, we get connection on the town website. As we're going to develop a housing production plan, which is sort of the first step. It looks at the seriousness and the nature of the housing situation, and then we'll develop a plan on how we want to approach it. I'll just throw one stat out and stop here that I was kind of surprised by. 23% of the full-time residents in Stockbridge are living on $25,000 a year less. So if we drive by a lot of houses in town, we don't know what's going on behind those doors, and there are a lot of people struggling with minimal incomes and stressed out costs of housing, taxes, insurance, upkeep, maintenance, yards, houses, roofs, the whole thing. And so we really have to look at this in a holistic way. So some of it is to maintain and keep going with the housing that we have, and some of it is to try to develop new housing that targets those who are most in need.
Yeah, so part of today is going to be about sharing resources and what we just experienced there. Patty, do we have a message about our live feed? short of it is Thursday, July 29th, 6:30 to 7:30. June 29th, thank you, June 29th. So this Thursday, June 29th, 6:30 to 7:30 at the library. Carolyn will be there, and Randy Warren will be there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so more opportunities for conversation. Thanks for bringing that here. So I want to begin just by introducing our panelists. Closest to me here we have Carolyn Valley, the CEO of Central Berkshire Habitat for Humanity. And next we have Kate. Kate Colihan, she's the housing navigator for Construct. Welcome, thank you. Matthew Russert, he's a legislative assistant for Congressman Neal. Thanks for being here. Next we have Jennifer. Jennifer is the Director of Community Engagement at Berkshire Housing. And then at the end is Eileen Pelletier, the CEO of Berkshire Housing Services. Thank you all for being here. And I thought we would start by just, and maybe Carolyn will start with you and then work our way down. And take about 5 or 7 minutes or so and introduce yourself, talk about the organization, maybe some of the major issues you're seeing in the area, and maybe different strategies you're using to address some of those challenges. And again, so cards will be going down. If you have any questions, please make sure to write them down, raise your hand, and I'll come grab those cards.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm Carolyn Valley, I'm the CEO. I've been with this affiliate for maybe going on 17 years. I was the first paid, I'll bring it closer to me. Is that better? Oh my God, it's kind of scary now. I'm still Carolyn. And so I've been with the affiliate for going on 17 years. I was the first paid staff. So we started with all volunteers, which is volunteers are in our DNA, so you guys are all important to us because that's how we get our work done. But what we have seen over the 17 years is there had been a long time where housing was not really recognized as being the critical problem that we see it is today. I'm going to say that it has always been a critical problem. The difference is we're more aware of it now because after COVID. I mean, because so many people now see it, their children are not able to stay here and work. The rents are unaffordable. Especially in South County, the house prices are out of reach for most normal people. So we're seeing that there has to be a shift in how we approach housing, because there needs to be housing for all. It's not just for one sector, or there just really needs to be options for everybody. So that's why I'm happy that we're part of the coalition that's always talking about this with Berkshire Housing and One Berkshire. And what we have found over the 2 years that we were doing studies is there are so many factors that make housing unaffordable besides the lack of inventory. The cost of building right now is outrageous. I mean, we saw an uptick in construction costs during COVID that has not backed down. It is at about 300% more than it was prior to. In addition, there's a new building code that has just come into play that is increasing prices by 15% with a big push to do all electric houses. But what that brings forward is that most of the time, low or moderate income people can't afford to put the solar on the roof. So now they're going to be held hostage by a monopoly electric company that can change the rates. And when we talk to past homeowners, people in the neighborhood, people that were just at the housing conversation last week, what people are saying is, how are we going to be protected from the utility cost? Even if we could get into somewhere that we could afford, how are we going to get protected about that? Because again, we're setting up for vulnerability. So there's a lot of factors, and I'm always thinking about what can we do together beyond just the building of the houses. And I think that this is a critical component, is we need to do effective advocacy and education, and always asking the question, what can we do different, what can we do better, but also making sure our voices are heard at the decision-making tables that are going to affect policy and the dollars that flow down. So I'll pass it to Katie.
My name is Kate Houlihan, and I'm the housing navigator for Construct in Great Barrington. I've worked with Construct for the last year, and apparently, before COVID, we did not have as many assist requests for rents or utilities. People are in crisis during COVID and after. I think we served, oh boy, I can't even remember, 1,500 households from COVID on. And this is people in need that have fallen behind on rent, and their tanks are empty, they don't have heat. And so we try to help as many people as we can, but there are limitations. Monetarily as well as location. We serve southern Berkshire County. And as a housing navigator, I actually speak with everybody on our wait list as I update. It's necessary for us to do that so that we can get a hold of someone if an apartment becomes available, which isn't going to happen anytime soon. The waiting list is frozen. So oftentimes what I'm doing is trying not to offer false hope, but almost coach people and really spend time talking to them about what opportunities they may have in their life to help them find housing. So every person's situation is unique, and yet so many are sharing this disparity. So I don't know, I think that's it.
Hi, my name is Matthew Russett. I'm a legislative aide for Congressman Richard Neal in his DC office. And I want to thank you guys for having me here today. It's a beautiful day in the Berkshires, a beautiful church service and a beautiful church. So I guess explain a little bit why there's a staffer from DC here. I'm originally from Pittsfield, born and raised, and I grew up in a house that my father grew up in because his father bought it when he got out of World War II, was hired at General Electric, where he worked for 38 years. And so, for me, housing, that generational housing, was integral in my life. I think it was maybe taken for granted a little bit, but I really got what a house can be so much more for a family than just a place to live. And when I went away to college in Boston, I moved back to Berkshire County after to work for Congressman Neal as a district aide in his Pittsfield office. And in that job, I covered the 32 towns of Berkshire County and the 24 what we called hill towns up on the Berkshire Plateau. And the housing situation, I think, is very different in the north, the central, the south, and up in the hill towns. I remember, as a Pittsfield kid, I was from the city. I would later learn in college that I'm not from the city. But I remember when I got back here in Congressman Neal and I ran around to all 54 towns that I covered, I got a really hard lesson in rural poverty. And I got a really hard lesson in what's happening in the hills. You can't see them like you can on the streets of Pittsfield. Those kids come to the bus stop that maybe didn't have breakfast, maybe don't have dinner when they're going home that night. And so 3 years after working up here, and I should say, when I was in Berkshire County, I was very interested in the housing markets. I was very involved with Habitat for Humanity and trying to help create opportunities for other people, similar to the ones that I had, just a home, a permanent home that was yours to live in. But after 3 years, Congressman Neal hired me down in his DC office where I took over a legislative portfolio, which included housing. And so I think when you're down on the federal level thinking about housing policy, thinking about rent affordability, rental access, housing affordability, housing access, how that dovetails together with homelessness. And it really, to me, I think boils down to the access of funding, which I can get more into as this discussion goes on, but it's about to get pretty challenging, I think. For Section 8 vouchers, for community development block grants for the home program, some of these things that we rely on to create affordable housing. It is going to be a difficult picture, I think, this budget year. So, looking forward to the discussion, and thank you again for having me here.
Good morning, my name is Jen Meehan. I am the Director of Community Engagement at Berkshire Housing. Thank you for having us this morning. This is wonderful, important work and a beautiful way to spend it on a Sunday, so thank you for that. Berkshire Housing is a property development and management organization that serves the Berkshires wide. So going from our Williamstown properties all the way down to South County. We certainly cover the entire county and assist with housing solutions for everyone from stem to stern. So one of the major initiatives that I work on at Berkshire Housing is our Coalition of Change, which is a new coalition. You just received a handout on it. We convened first in January, and most of the work that we're doing is a direct result of a housing report that was compiled by several housing practitioners and professionals throughout the county and other community stakeholders and leaders in the spring of 2022. One Berkshire commissioned the report, and this coalition is a direct response to some of the strategies listed for that to assist with our current housing crisis throughout the Berkshires. So that's a main component of the work that I do at Berkshire Housing, and it really looks at how we can work countywide for those education and advocacy pieces that Carolyn mentioned that are so important. And while we take a countywide approach when it comes to funding and greater initiatives, the coalition also understands the uniqueness of every town and city throughout the county. So knowing that we need to take a regional approach for those funding and those larger advocacy and education issues, but really drilling down to what's important within each of those towns. So that we can look at a larger vision and not get ourselves in the siloed work and where we're just kind of treading water all the time. So, and to Matt's point in terms of, whether it's funding through the Commonwealth or federal funding, really looking at what that means for all of us throughout the county. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Eileen so that she can tell you some more about Berkshire Housing and our initiatives.
Of those. The vast majority being affordable, which we talked about in our conversation. We also provide about 700 Section 8 vouchers, they're called rental housing vouchers, to individuals living in private apartments across the Berkshires. And then in addition to that, we are the regional administrative agency for the state administering what is called RAF, which is a rental assistance program. So this is the emergency assistance program. What I want to speak to is, and so we've got a lovely little thing, and we can talk about the initiatives, and I think we should certainly talk about the Housing Resource Center because I really believe there's a great role for the faith community in that. But before we go there, I wanted to talk about what I find, so the topic of this conversation is about the housing crisis. My organization was started 52 years ago because we were experiencing a housing crisis. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King's platform was about racial justice and housing. So it's not a new concept, and I think there is an awareness of it, partly because of COVID, and to be clear, we all wanted everybody in a home because it was safer, right? Get in your homes, be safe. We became more aware of it. But this issue is a social justice issue. It's been around for a very long time. It's about economic justice. It's very much about racial justice. And I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation, but I think we have to remember that it's not a new issue. And culturally, things have changed. Homelessness is more visible for us, so we see it a little bit more in the streets. It's always been there, but that's to some degree the changing, dynamics of generations and how we present. So that's one message I want. The second message I want to deliver is that I firmly believe, and you know, Carolyn mentioned, it isn't a supply issue alone. It is somewhat about supply. But what we tend to do as individuals trying to solve the problem, we all want to figure out how to build a very expensive building and believe that that's going to change it. But if we're dealing with a long-standing issue that's really roots are in social justice, there's so much more to do. And so as Jen was speaking about this coalition of change, being advocates, understanding the issue enough to be able to speak and represent, you know, at town meetings where a project is coming up and there are NIMBY issues happening, or, you know, advocating to the legislature at the state and federal level for funding. That's a powerful tool. And then, so in my mind, there's sort of three issues. There is a supply issue. There certainly is a supply issue. And when you break down the supply issue, it's often, well, I would love to ask this question. How many people lived in the Berkshires 50 years ago? Go, Patrick. Do you know how many?
How many?
Yeah.
150,000.
How many live here today?
112, 114.
How do we have a supply? So it's a cultural phenomenon of how we live in our homes, right? The homes, there's a lot fewer people living in it. That's some of it. There are homes offline because they've aged. You know, they need work. So there's much more than just build the next apartment building, right? I mean, if we chose to do shared housing, if we figured out how to, as your pastor was speaking, being in relationship, be in community with each other, welcoming individuals into our home, if that could be culturally okay and not, today I think we think it's like creepy or something, right? We could eliminate this problem, right, without building units. So I just challenge you to think differently about the supply issue. The affordability issue has been long-standing, and that is much about a social justice issue. And it's greatly about wage disparity, and it's about flat wages for a very, very long time. And there are exceptions to that. Our businesses are doing great. But what I see, you know, I've been doing this for 17 years, what I see is people living in my affordable housing, working a full-time job at Dunkin' Donuts and a full-time job at Cumberland Farms to make it work. So, today, I was gonna say maybe $10 an hour, and I think they're up to like 16 or 17. But, so it's almost an impossible challenge, this challenge of affordability. And then the last piece, the piece that, to me, is where we see a lot of judgment, is people have complex life resumes. They have stories, right? We all have complex life resumes, right? But if you've experienced trauma and you have, you know, mental illness or substance use disorder or any of those numbers of challenges, our culture says pick yourself up by your bootstraps and figure it out. But the reality is, in practice, we all know this, the people who successfully pick themselves up almost always have a family member, a mentor, someone in their lives. I say this to my staff sometimes, you know, my manager will get frustrated, like, what is up with this person? And they you know, you hear them say, well, I struggle too. And I always say, who'd you have? Who's that person in your life that helped you? So we've created this culture where too many people, like 1 in 3, you know, probably people in our population don't have any community. And I think there's so much, I mean, everything I'm saying resonates so much with the faith community. There's so much to offer the conversation. And so I'll leave you with a thought about the Housing Resource Center, which is essentially a day shelter for people who are unhoused or really for anybody, but the focus is unhoused. It will have, you know, all the basic essentials, a place to go to the bathroom, a shower, a place to charge your phone. If you can use it as an address, should you be trying to apply for a job and you don't have an address to put on the application. But what we're hoping that place will become is a place that individuals who are experiencing homelessness are empowered, that it's their living room, it's their home, and that we as community members will be in relationship with those individuals. So I'm so thrilled that you are talking to the Church of the Beloved next month, And Jenny can speak so much better to this than I, but she has this beautiful way, you know, and I think this is the direction where a lot of the faith community is going, about thinking about service, right? And thinking about your commitment to service and doing it in a different way. So I think that's really exciting that you're having that conversation tomorrow. And the Church of the Beloved will be an active participant in how we operate this Housing Resource Center for developing in Pittsfield. So I'm going to stop there because I'm imagining this will be a fun conversation. We should leave lots of time for it.
Thank you so much for that. That was really informative. I want to open it up for questions. A couple of options here. We do have cards, and if you prefer for me to read the question, I'm happy to come around and grab the card and read the question. If you're comfortable, you're welcome to come up to the microphone and ask your question as well. So let me open it up, and if there's any initial questions. Do you want to come up, Ronnie?
Yes. I'm wondering if any of you...
We're going to try and use the microphone. Thanks.
I'm wondering if any of you were involved in the new buildings on South Street in Great Barrington, which look lovely, by the way, and it's nice to see that they're occupied. And my other question is, what's happening with Wildflower Farm that was supposed to be turned into housing for local workers?
Windflower Inn.
Windflower, excuse me.
No problem. Thank you for asking. Windflower Inn is kind of a pilot program for workforce housing. There are 3 tiers of eligibility. You must make at least $28,800 or have a cosigner. So we're filled. There are 13 rooms. We bought the inn in December, and it recently just totally became filled. So we have full occupation and shared spaces, living spaces, and the grounds, and they're private bedrooms, fully furnished. So there's no storage for anything. So it's very temporary, I think, for most people. It's still, it's not cheap. The workforce housing is for people that earn up to 65% of the local AMI, which is that $28,800 figure. And that rent is, I think it's $800, and it goes up to $950, $875 in the middle. So that's been incredibly hopeful. We also recently bought this beautiful estate in Marlborough called Casillas Farm, and that's going to be a few years out. There are 2 separate properties on that estate, as well as Windflower. That also has 2 separate properties. So we're looking at, right now, I think we're managing, if you include the private rooms, about 81 units throughout Great Barrington, Stockbridge, and Lee. And we hope to increase that somehow, but there are a lot of different factors that are going to come into play. But that's our dream, is to keep growing and be able to offer more and more people affordable housing.
I can speak to the South Street project. So that was a project developed by CDC of South Berkshire and an organization called Wayfinders, which is kind of like our sister organization in the Springfield area. And there are 49 apartments. It's called Windrush. And we are, every time we get a CO, we are moving people in. We did a lottery several months ago, had several hundred people interested, and we are just waiting for the construction, for the paint to dry. But we should have most people in by mid-July, is our expectation. So that is a mix of affordable housing, a little bit of workforce housing. I don't believe there are even any market rate units there. So it's also across the street from Boswood Gardens, which is another property that we own, which is senior affordable housing. So it's really creating kind of a nice community down there at Windrush.
Thank you.
What are the biggest obstacles to developing affordable and workforce housing, and what can local towns do to promote more affordable housing? Jump ball.
I'm always happy to talk about the challenges of development. So, you know, in the big picture, I will say, as a developer of affordable housing in New England, just to say it out loud once there, one of the biggest challenges is a flat piece of land that is clean and connected to infrastructure. And I say that because I think often people will drive around and think, oh, we should make housing out of that building. Why aren't they doing that? It doesn't have some of those things. So we certainly do old buildings. Eagle Mill, the project you see referenced in our in the paper that we sent out. I mean, that mill is a challenge, and it's amazing. So we are willing to be the lobster, take the thing that nobody else wants, and make it beautiful, and we do that a lot. But that is a real challenge. You know, beyond that, to develop affordable housing, one of the tenets of organizations like ours is that we want to do what a community wants, right? So we're not, if you remember the days of public housing, really it was the federal government saying, we're going to come in and we're putting that tower there, and you don't really have a heck of a lot to say in the matter. Well, affordable housing today, we're called community development corporations, we work with community. So we need communities to be part of the partnership. So when we, experience a funding gap in a project, which has happened with every project since COVID, the first question the state administrators say is, did you go back to the town and ask them for a little more money? And so, to be clear, it could be a $40 million project, and the town has put in 25, and they're going to put in another 20. It's not necessarily about the number of zeros. It's about that commitment from the community in the town. So town commitment, community commitment is huge. When we don't have that, or even if we have it sort of initially, and we run into NIMBY, not in my backyard issues during a zoning, some sort of permit process, having people, so this is what Jen's work is really about having people be able to get up and speak to why it's important and what it is and what it isn't. Because, we recently did a convening in Lenox where we talked about affordable housing 101. So there's a whole conversation to be had about what are we even talking about, right? I mentioned public housing, and then there's Section 8 vouchers, and then there's affordable. There's so many different sort of types and mixes, and people who are coming from a place of fear go right to the lowest common denominator and make a lot of assumptions about who's living there. So being informed and educated, because we certainly can run into those barriers, and certainly as towns and communities, what I call sort of setting the stage or getting ready for the date for developers to want to come into a community and do development. They look at zoning. They look at a history of NIMBY issues. So before I ever put a shovel in the ground, I've spent several $100,000s of dollars. So if I'm going to end up losing at a permit process because the community's not supportive, I'm going to the next one, right? So getting ready by doing things like being informed, showing support, having an affordable housing trust, having zoning that is flexible and supports different kinds of options. We can get caught up in things like, we really want to make sure everybody has this amount of green space and a place to put your bike, which is wonderful. I'm all for all the green stuff. But if that takes a project off the table, a site off the table, be flexible about it. Don't write the zoning so restrictive that you're trying to pack everything in and then it's impossible to develop. So those are my thoughts initially.
And I'll jump in on it too. And I think part of the thing that you're doing right now is getting a housing plan, right? You're having somebody study it so that they already know what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and then bringing in housing practitioners early on before you write that RFP, right? Let's have a meeting of the minds. Let's have conversations. Let's hold community meetings so that you can hear what the people in your community are really saying. And then there's the opportunity of actually trying to have them understand why it is important for them, as well as for the people that you're trying to house, right? Like if we in our community cannot have CNAs, if we don't have people that first-year students or like first-year teachers, if we don't have first-year firemen in our community, what happens when the kids are enrolled? What happens when that fire happens and there isn't anybody there to put it out? So it's about having people understand that we have to make decisions as a community that benefits the entire community. So having those conversations early on as part of your planning process, getting that housing report, start having the conversations early, because that's when you can start changing the hearts and minds of people there. And as Eileen said, we really need to hear yes in my backyard, and they need to be the first people at the mic, because there's a statistic that says whoever the first 5 people are, that's what gets remembered. So we need to make sure the first 10 people speaking are the yes in my backyard. Because I don't know about you guys, but I want to make sure there's a fireman available to put my house out if there's a fire.
We heard earlier today from both Isaiah and Pastor Brent how we should invite people into our home. And then Eileen mentioned it a little while ago. So what does that look like? And what sort of support is there in your organizations for that sort of thing to happen?
You're looking at me, so I guess I'm going to attempt to answer that. I think it looks like culture change, right? And I think as a country, we're a little bit stuck on this. 1 in 3 Americans live alone, right? We have, a youth that is doing this all day long. Although I have to say, I do think they have more I think they desire community. It became because they know they didn't have it. But I think, culturally, it's a real challenge right now. And that's why I said I see some alignment with the faith community, because, I grew up Catholic in Worcester, Mass, and, the church for me was that place for community, right? And I'm sure all of you did too, but well, how do we create that, right? So the numbers, as we all know, are dwindling for many faith groups, but how do we create some sort of community? I don't know. Now it's the coffee shop, right? That's where people are having conversations. So that, there are some interesting things. I know in England, they have a program where they basically train people on how to talk to somebody who's different, who maybe has a different experience. To be blunt, how do you walk up to someone who's clearly, slept on the streets last night? How do you engage in a conversation? How do you feel safe? How do you make them feel that you consider them an equal human being and worthy? I think that's like a whole thing that we need to learn. I go to bed every night believing that most of the people who drive by people who are homeless or, look the other way are not bad people. They just don't actually know how to engage. So, I don't know. I think it has to become a thing that isn't a profession, right? I mean, I do this for work. We all do this for work, but it has to go beyond that. It has to be a responsibility of the community to not tolerate that, to not tolerate. I would like everyone to look at homelessness and the challenges around housing like they look at the kid in the well. Like, we're all going to run and drop everything and do something about it. But I don't quite know how you get there, but that's some thoughts on it.
I hate to always be ping-ponging between me and Eileen, but this actually just came up on Friday. A woman came into the office. Her husband was a veteran. They have a home in Lanesboro. For the last 4 years, she's been caring for him with pancreatic cancer. He died 2 weeks ago. He left a boatload of bills. They had to remortgage their house because they had medical bills that needed to be cared for. And she said, what am I going to do? Because now the veterans benefits that covered
most of our housing expenses and life expenses are gone. And now I'm by myself and I'm not sure what to do. And as we chatted, she said, and the other piece is, I don't know what to do for me right now. Because for 4 years, I've done nothing but care for him, and I can't get my mind clear. I can't figure out what to do next. So the first thing we said is, let's get you into, there's 2 churches in Pittsfield that have bereavement groups. I was like, let's get you in a bereavement group. Let's have you sit down and meet with our community navigator to work out what your actual budget is. And she said, but you know what? My town is probably going to take away my reduced tax basis because he was a veteran, and that's what we got the reduced taxes on. Are they going to take that away from us now? Because I don't know what I'll do then. So we started doing some brainstorming, and when I started asking her what the house construction looked like, I was like, you know what? I know at least 2 people that are in a similar boat to you. What if we talked about co-sharing? But we have to do it with intention. We have to do it with thinking about, I hate to say it, worst case scenarios. You have to have a written agreement. What could that look like? And so that's one of the things that we're going to look at is what could that look like for these 3 people that are in very similar situations. Now, it's not something that is a government done thing, but it could be an area where people could be like trained on how to be able to have those conversations with people, to be able to support something like that, and to put a structure in. So we're hoping that, you know, that this comes up so that we can kind of track it out, see what the problems were, what the successes were, and go from there. But I think it's something that we do have to think about when we have houses sometimes that are very large and one person living in it. But you can't necessarily, you know, I wish there was like eHarmony for that kind of matchup, but there isn't. Believe me, we've done some condos where I wish there was an eHarmony. But we need to be thoughtful and start thinking outside of the box so that everybody can get a win on this.
Hi, I'm Nancy Mills from Stockbridge. I became familiar with the concept of co-housing several years ago, and Mark and I lived in Jamaica Plain for a few years, and there's a successful urban co-housing there, and I know there have been some long-standing successful ones in the Connecticut, well, I guess Connecticut Valley, Northampton, Amherst area. Has that ever been considered in the Berkshires? And if not, what can we do to possibly make that happen? Because I do think it helps with intergenerational support and this idea of building community. Thanks.
So prior to moving to the Berkshires, I was in Vermont for a very long time and actually very involved in several different co-housing initiatives. And they are great models. The best, but they're very expensive, to be clear. I mean, if you look at the cost of the housing, it's typically new construction. There's a lot of challenges. So I spent about 5 years trying to do an affordable model of co-housing, and maybe Carolyn can crack this nut in Berkshires if it hasn't happened already, but it is challenging. One of the things, though, that several co-housing groups have done is dedicate, so if they're creating a 15-home community, 2 or 3 of them have subsidies to them, so down payment assistance, so they'll be permanently affordable to lower income individuals. So that's certainly a tool that should be looked at. In co-housing, communities, it's a choice, it's not for everybody. People like, my best friends live in a co-housing community. I was just there 2 weeks ago, and they've lived there for a long time, and there are good and bads in it. I think certainly having people, one of the challenges of having different income levels and different life experiences as an education is that the community has to be very respectful of that, because it's all about being inclusive and making sure people participate. But I mean, it can happen, but they're not really any more affordable than any other homes unless we bring tools. And I don't know, Carolyn, are you aware of any in the Berkshires? Or?
Not yet, but that's one of the things that just, I made a note, it's like, hey, ask them to be on the committee that helps figure that out, right? So that's where you guys can really come in. It's like, let's not throw any idea out that it's impossible until we do the work of finding out if we can make it possible. So in the situation like Eileen's talking about, that was a new co-housing community, right? The thing that I'm talking about is the existing stock that's right here today, that she has a 4-bedroom house. Let's figure out how 3 other people can benefit from that and they can all live affordable. And it doesn't, like after the initial, I'm gonna call it matchmaking rules setting up, I could see where they could, they're all, like just living together. I don't know, I think many of you are my age. Remember that Kate and Alex show where the 2 divorced women came together with their kids and they lived together and were happy? Like that's what I want to see happen. Like it doesn't have to be, it could be families, but it could just be individual people, but there would need to be a structure set up so that everybody's protected.
So that model is shared housing, and it's actually become pretty popular in some urban areas like San Francisco, New York, Boston, and young people are doing it. A lot of young people are pushing for it because they cannot afford to live in these communities. So they have leases and they have almost like that co-housing, like how do we be in relation, how clean does the bathroom need to be, right? You gotta figure those things out. So I think there's a lot of hope in that, and I'm totally with you, Carolyn, with the divorce, 60-something-year-olds all together.
Matt just shared that he does shared housing himself. He's going to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm, younger, I guess. We just call it having roommates. But I guess I'll share a little bit about my housing situation. I was up here in Berkshire County when Congressman Neal told me he wanted to work in D.C. It was the middle of COVID. It was December 2020. The shops weren't out yet. And so, I think in that situation, I've got at least consider living by yourself. But at the same time, I was moving down to a new city where I didn't know anybody and I didn't want to be alone. And so I had a friend who had lived in Arlington previously. I'd been down there, I thought it was nice, so I found a house. Where I'm from in Arlington, and a lot of the area of Arlington is it's old officer housing. It's just these brick houses that were thrown up in the 40s. So all these officers who go work at the Pentagon. And so it's like 1,200 square feet, and my roommate is my landlord. It's me, and so 4 guys total. The owner's the landlord. He rents out to 3 other guys' rooms, and it was just massively more affordable. A studio apartment in DC, maybe 1,700, probably 1,900. 1 bedroom, over 2,000. And, I got no complaints. I got street parking, I have a nice backyard. I don't know, I'm 29 years old and I still have roommates, which I think is maybe a little less than ideal, but, as far as, going down to a new city and finding people that I knew, we're not like the best of friends, but we watch games together. There's someone home there, if you want to be alone, you can go in your room. If you want to be with other people, we hang out in the living room. We watch sports, we hang out, but we have our own lives. So, to the extent that that's happening, I think, one, goes forward, because I know it's a community, but probably also hits on that kids my age cannot afford to live, really. There's an affordability problem, and it's everywhere. It's not obviously New York, San Francisco, DC, Boston, you're gonna hear about it. It's in Flagstaff, Arizona, it's in, it is across America, affordability is difficult. So in the sense that, it's cheaper and it brings housing stock online, I think that could be a good solution for this community.
Hello, I'm Patrick White, I'm one of the selectmen here in Stockbridge. I've got a couple of questions and then a couple of observations. Mark mentioned that we're doing a housing production plan, and at the meeting last Monday, which is on Zoom, we should watch, it was really interesting. Our consultant pointed out that
to the income required to purchase a single-family home in Stockbridge at the average, which at $600,000 doesn't get you a lot of house, as many of you may know now, is about $160,000, $170,000 a year. All right, even if you're 2 teachers or whatever kind of, we could do the best, occupancy we could think of, but for most families, that's out of reach. But then she pointed out that it's renting half that home. I mean, family lives in the other half. We can bring that cost of ownership here in Stockbridge down to $62,000. So let's say the house is $800,000, and we can bring it down to $90,000 or $100,000. That's all of a sudden within reach to a whole lot of folks that are a couple of folks who have a wide variety of professions. And that's really a path, but there's an impediment to that path, which is local zoning sometimes. It's harder to build a 2-family in Stockbridge than it should be, and I think we need to change that. And you're going to see some proposals to change that, and I hope so. And Representative Neal's a colleague, you either love her or hate her. Representative Alexandria Cortez, watch her speech on what she calls exclusionary zoning, and examine whether or not, which was, I think, completely unintended in places like the Berkshires, but whether or not there is some validity to when it's harder to build a 2-family than it's a 1-family, how do we address those issues? So I hope that at the federal level, we see some of that. At the state level, we have some of the people in this county with the most juice at this panel. And I will tell you this, when you start talking about revenue streams, you got to think out of the box, all right? If you buy a ticket to Tanglewood, you're going to pay some monopoly ticket broker $3.50 for basically the right to buy that ticket on the web, all right? And yet it's controversial, because I've suggested this in the past, and it's gotten absolutely nowhere. It's controversial to suggest that there should be a $1,000 dedicated fee on that ticket for housing. Why is that controversial? This county sells millions of tickets a year, and you want a revenue stream. Let the folks who are blessed with the ability to come visit our beautiful place contribute a little bit toward housing. Because I'll tell you this, these taxpayers cannot afford the $2 or $3 million it will cost to clear those 2 pieces of land that Eileen was talking about. When you're already struggling to keep your house, we're going to need to have alternative sources. The Cape has a 2% extra tax on its local occupancy to fund water. Chicopee, Worcester, Boston has 2% extra tax on to fund conventions. Why can't the Berkshires and the hill towns get that 2% to fund housing? And I just feel like when you're talking to decision makers, because, in a little fish, it's easy to be a big fish in a little pond like Stockbridge, but, you guys have the contacts to move the needle on some of these issues that I believe we really need your help on, because we have the will. And this is not an NIMBY community, but, what we really need is thinking outside, to come up with different ways to fund it. I'll make one last point from that. Okay. You talked about your dad and granddad buying a house in the 40s. My dad bought a house here in 1960, all right? If you go on Medicaid, which is called Mass Health, and you're in your 50s, in the United States of America, you can lose your house when you die to pay that Medicaid bill. So someone gets laid off who's 50 years old and has to go on Mass Health and has to take care of themselves, and that house no longer is passed intergenerational because the government comes and sells the house upon death to pay that bill. Massachusetts, it generates $10 or $20 million on a $50 billion budget. And what are we doing taking houses away from local intergenerational families so we can pay back the government because somebody who loses their job has to go on Mass Health to fund it? You want to do something to help the families in this area, get rid of that law, because even if you're taking 30 or 40 or 50 houses out of that intergenerational stream, it's the only way some people in the Berkshires are ever going to be able to afford to live here is if they inherit their house, and yet the policies don't support that. So anyways, I guess there was no question. Sorry.
That's a lot of context. I appreciate it. Just notice the passion in your voice. This is obviously a very passionate subject for a lot of different reasons. I want to do a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes left. So I do want to give some space for that and leave some room, and we have a couple more questions, but any thoughts or comments based on that?
I'm not an expert on Medicare. That's not something I cover for Congressman, but I'm happy to look into it and follow up with you.
Yeah, it's a Medicaid thing, totally agree with you, Patrick. Yeah, it's Medicaid, so it's not you. You're the federal. Yeah, so it's low-income individuals, yeah. But I guess what I was thinking about as Patrick was talking was, it is that combination of, and Jen has a slide where she talks about this, the cost of transportation, the cost of housing, and the cost of healthcare. So honestly, which gets at what I was saying earlier, this is an issue of poverty. It's an issue of poverty, and poverty doesn't always present like we have in our heads. There are many, many people who are, living in poverty. And today the challenge is we have defined, because there was a study done 40 years ago, that poverty is 80% or below AMI, and there's levels of poverty. But today you can be at 180% of the area median income, and you're making choices about whether or not you can have dinner tonight. If you're paying for your health care and you have to drive to your job, and so when to circle back to that crisis comment, the economic housing crisis is expanding because of those other factors are expanding. So I do think they're all related, and I love the idea of figuring out not only how to build two families, because it is smart and it can be a way of wealth building for lower income individuals. You can get them into learning to be a landlord, etc. But I also always, this may be controversial in Stockbridge, where there are many beautiful homes, but can we divide them up somehow? Like, can you create a larger one? Can you make it?
I want to leave a little space for two last questions and one more question that someone had written in.
Having watched the fire drill when immigrant families arrive about where to house them, I'm wondering if anybody is thinking about temporary housing for immigrants as they arrive.
The state is very actively involved. I think most people know that Massachusetts is the only state in the country where you have a right to shelter. So if people come to Massachusetts, we will house you somewhere. It's a huge challenge for the state. It's costly, but there's a deep commitment to it. So there are several of my colleagues who are, I guess I would say, sort of operating and providing services and food to migrant families who are in hotels. You probably read about MCLA's conversation about bringing, that was really for migrant families. Very unfortunate that didn't happen. It's a huge challenge, and there's this, part of the conversation that is being had as well. We've got to get these people in hotels. We've got to get them into permanent housing right away. And I'm kind of going, okay, I have like 2,000 people on my waiting list, and I mean, I care about what's happening to these migrant families, but I also care about the person who has been sitting in the Berkshires for 5 years, housing insecure, right? So it's a really tough challenge, but the state is basically treating it much like they did COVID, in a total emergency response mode at this point. So I don't know where it's all going to go, but it's been very quiet and not talked about a lot in the paper, as far as I can see.
There is sort of like a bit of an underground network going on. Our community navigators, we have Hispanic navigators and French-speaking navigators, and what they're oftentimes are getting phone calls about saying, people have come here, they've been able to find them a room to rent for $700-800, but their entire family is having to live in that room, and just trying to get them food supports and stuff that they would not be eligible because they don't have documentation. but the community themselves are actually banding together to assist the people that are coming in. But the problem is getting bigger and bigger, and the other agency that's doing a great job on that is VIM in Great Barrington. And they're going to be opening a site in Pittsfield as well. But VIM is doing a really good job of supporting for healthcare and also legal issues around immigration. There are people working on it. There just isn't a lot of funds coming into it. And also this church right here actually had sent in a donation to be able to help people that have come here to be able to support them. So we have a navigator that it helps provide some initial food when they get here because of your gift.
Who was founded by Stockbridge too. In fact, a guy named Matt Endo was a second homeowner. We have we thank him because Vim is basically our medicine. It's a volunteers medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was founded by folks right here in Stockbridge.
Yeah, they're a wonderful organization.
My question is, do you have income levels for affordable housing? Do you have a scale?
Yes.
Yes. Well, because I just did a little arithmetic, and supposing I worked 35 hours at $12.50, because most people are not getting $15 an hour, for a month, I'd earn something like $2,200 and something dollars. Well, multiply that by 12, that's not a very huge income. So would I be, I'm already happily ensconced, but would, how do you adjust for that?
I mean, you're bringing up a very valid point. Affordable housing isn't affordable to everyone. So the layering that happens in this is, I'm talking about rental housing, Carolyn can talk about home ownership, but in rental housing, the federal government largely, to some degree, the state sets income levels of affordability and sets what we can charge for rent. But what also happens is that sort of rental housing voucher program I mentioned, many times it's layered over. So like at Windrush, the apartment complex we were just talking about, many of the people move in, it's affordable to them if they're making, that 60% area median income and they can get in. But if they're at 20% area median income or 30%, they can't rent. It's a window, and we call it like the sort of tax credit affordable housing window. Like, it's not a big door, come on through. It's like, figure out how to get through the window. And so for lower income people, we really need vouchers. And I always say, like, we feel that food is an entitlement, and we get that there's enough food stamps for people. We don't look at housing that way. We accept the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who, by the numbers, should get into housing, but can't because there isn't enough subsidy or there isn't enough support for it. So it's a valid question, and there is not housing for everyone.
The other thing is that when Great Barrington was trying to show interest in housing issues, there is an ordinance on the books that a single family house, say in Housatonic, where I lived for 17 years, could be divided so that it would become a two-family house. That ordinance has never actually, it's been passed, but it's never been used. And the other thing is, I actually, when I lived in West Springfield, I lived in one unit of cluster housing, and it was 4 units on one city block, and it was very efficiently built, and I actually gave the design that I had in my head to the town planner, and he sent me to the cluster housing up in, near Fairview Common, and it's nothing like that at all. This is literally 4 units that are built on one town block, so I just want to run that by you.
We're out of time now. I'll just do one last question. For someone who is in the audience today, is in need of housing. For this person and other people in that similar position, what is the first step?
I can speak to this. This also answers in part a question about how to kind of figure out, how you fit into the affordable housing scale. Construct kind of qualifies people for eligibility a little bit differently than Berkshire Housing. We're much smaller, but we do have over 400 people, over 420 people on our list. As I reach out to people and update the list, that's gonna, some people have literally moved out of state. And, a lot of people they're just scattering, because if you are on Social Security and the property that you were living in that was naturally affordable is sold because the property appreciated $100,000 over the last year, and the landlord is like, I have to take this opportunity and sell, you have nowhere to go. You're making, $1,200 a month. Now, the way that we qualify you for different housing for Construct, we go by the neurographic scale or the LIHTC scale, which is updated every year, and it was just released last month. And so we have categories. If you make up to 30%, which is a shade under 21,000, you qualify for a certain kind of housing. If you are on SSI, you qualify for a unit that has a voucher attached to it. It's like a Section 8. It pays 70% of the rent. It does not move with you like a Section 8 does. It's there, like, attached to the property. So when you leave, the next person who moves in will get that subsidy. And unfortunately, that's our longest list. And then the next step up is up to 50% and 60%, which are people that work in our community. And then we do have some market rate. And I don't remember the figure. I think 50 is maybe just like a touch, maybe 32, a hair under 32,000 a year. But if someone needs to find housing, please call me or talk to me. Everyone, like I said before, has a unique situation and may have options that they're not really aware of, because it's kind of a scary thing to be in such need of housing right now, right here. So,
So I want to touch on ownership, right? There are many things that make ownership possible or also impossible. So for example, we have 2-unit condos in Pittsville. There's 6 of them. Matt helped build some of them, so he knows. Before COVID hit, or before the interest rate started going up, those 4-bedroom, high-efficiency homes with a homeowners association, taxes, insurance, principal, and interest was $1,000 a month. The next families that are going to be purchasing the 2 middle units are probably going to have to pay $1,500 a month, because the interest rate has gone up so much, which also affects the, when you have to work with it used to be called Department of Housing and Community Development, now it's HULC, I guess. Anywho, so they say you have to factor in X number of percentage, and you also have to assume that there's PMI. Well, with the Habitat program, there is no PMI, because getting into the house, like if we use the example of the property we have on Grove Street in Great Barrington, that'll be opened up very soon, the sales price of that is $250,000. The appraised value of it is about $425,000. So do we need to have private mortgage insurance when you already have more than double the value of the house? That needs to change, right? The other thing is the taxes. I mean, if a community wants to look at those people that are making $23,000, there are mechanisms in other communities that you can look at and say, hey, this is the way to do it. So people that that own their own home, that are now struggling to make those taxes, you can make provisions to change that. And that is true whenever you're doing affordable homeownership. We have to think about other ways. I've been talking to a lot of banks. We've been very fortunate because we have a lot of our lenders that will give quote unquote a habitat rate, which is lower than what a person can get on the open market. The Affordable Housing Trust give down payment assistance, that helps to get the principal price down. But when we just did a homeowner analysis of somebody in our community that bought their house 10 years ago. Their principal's $172. The rest of the $700 is their taxes and their insurance. So there's a problem, and we have to think of creative solutions to make that work.
I just want to make sure we answer the individual's question. So certainly call Construct, but Berkshire Housing also operates the Housing Consumer Education Center for the county, which is an opportunity to reach out, whether you're low income or high income, it doesn't matter. It's housing solutions for anyone. We will work with you to strategize. One of the unfortunate things about the housing world is that, as you heard mentioned, there's complicated layers of like, well, this department has this funding and this confusing income level you need to make. So we don't currently have a common application, right? So it should be that we have an intake form and we will help connect you if you want to live in Great Barrington or if you want to live in Adams. But you should both reach out to Berkshire Housing, and then if you have a specific area you want to live, you want to live within the Berkshires, there's Construct, there's other organizations to reach out to, and unfortunately you have to reach out to all of them. But we can help you know who those are. So it's berkshirehousing.com, and it's the Housing Consumer Education Center.
Thank you all panelists. That was really helpful. I don't know if there's still more refreshments out in the JE room, but they're all put away. Okay. So people are welcome to hang out and chat with the panelists for a few minutes, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.